Hello everyone, this is Hilal Ahmad Mohammadzai. In this presentation, I would like to talk about a philosophical ethical theory, which is utilitarianism. Jeremy Bentham, an English famous philosopher and also a social reformer, first introduced this philosophical and ethical theory of utilitarianism. Therefore, he's considered the father of utilitarianism. However, later on, this theory was developed and popularized by another English philosopher, John Stuart Mill. Now, what is utilitarianism? In simple words, utilitarianism it's a philosophical and ethical theory which focus on consequences and outcome of an action. So, regardless of giving importance to behavior of an action or whether an action is legal or not, whether an action is preferable to people, whether human mind or logic accepted or not. The importance is given to the consequences and outcome of an action. So the sole purpose of this philosophical theory is to focus on consequences and result of an action. Therefore, it's a form of consequentialist ethics, which means it determines right or wrong, good or bad, evil or good, based on outcome of an action. So, based on utilitarianism, an act is morally good if it produces the greatest happiness, pleasure, benefit, or joy for a greatest or majority of people, or the greatest number of people. Uh, this theory of utilitarianism is based on principle of utility. Now, what is principle of utility? According to principle of utility, the property of any object tends to provide pleasure or happiness, benefits and prevent pain or unhappiness. That action is considered or possess the principle of utility. Means if an action have these characteristics of pleasure, happiness, benefits, that action possesses the principle of utility and it comes under the principle of utility. In simple words, actions are judged based on their ability whether they can promote the greatest amount of joy or happiness, a pleasure for the greatest number of people who are involved in that action or not. So if an action can produce the greatest amount of advantage, benefit for the greatest number of people, that action is totally right and it's considered a good action regardless of whether that action is lawful or not, good or not, ethical or not. Bentham's model of utilitarianism. Bentham developed a model for utilitarianism. For him, happiness, based on his theory, happiness is just simply the absence of pain. Now the question comes how to measure happiness, how to understand if an action happiness outweighs its unhappiness, how to understand the consequences of an action will be good, will bring advantages, will bring pleasure. So to understand this, we need to understand Bentham's formula for measuring happiness. So in order to measure the degree of happiness that a specific action may produce, Bentham introduced the philosophic calculus. It's a formula that he developed. Uh, this formula is also called utility calculus and also called hedonic calculus. It measures and computes the intensity, duration, also certainty, propinquity, and fecundity, purity, and extent of a pleasure. Means that uh, in this formula, the pleasure is measured whether it's intense or not, whether it's last long or not, and whether it's certain to happen for frequency, whether it will happen soon or not, or whether it's probably followed by another happiness or not, whether it's pure, and what is the extent of this pleasure means, does it provide benefit for majority or not? So based on this formula, the formula is the pleasure or sum of pleasure minus pain equal to balance. So for instance, if an action has 15 pleasure or happiness and 10 pain or unhappiness, so we will subtract or deduct the pain from pleasure and the balance, we will check the balance. So here we can see that the 5 is remained from the pleasure. So 5 is in favor of happiness. Therefore, this action will be considered a good action because it will bring happiness. So for Bentham, balance was the base for morality of an action. So if a balance of an action is in favor of pleasure, then the act is good. And if the balance is in favor of pain, the act is bad. Regardless of whether that act may be lawful or not, may be acceptable or not, may be preferable for everyone or not, but as long as it produces happiness, it's considered good. Or as if it's lawful, but still if it's lawful, but still it's not bringing happiness, it will be considered bad. So, what is the goal of utilitarianism? The goal of utilitarianism is to maximize happiness and well-being of all affected individuals. So, based on this theory of utilitarianism, as we said, an act is morally good if it produces the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. And an act is morally bad if it produces more pain than pleasure for the greatest number of people. So we can conclude based on this idea that utilitarianism does not care if an action is done using honest means, if an action is done using lawful way, if an action is ethical or not, whether a human mind accepts it or not, whether it's logical or whether it's preferable or not. As long as it produces pleasure, happiness, or benefits for a great number of people, it's considered a good action. It's right, and it's not considered wrong. We can take an example of stealing from rich to help poor. Now, how does explain the principle of utilitarianism? Based on principle of utilitarianism, an action produces good for a great number of people if it's considered good. So in this case, stealing from rich to help poor people is considered good because it produces happiness and great happiness for a great number of people. Suppose someone is stealing from a rich person and he's distributing the money or the wealth of that rich person between the poor and destitute people. So based on principle of utilitarianism, this person is doing a good action. He's doing the right action. However, stealing is an ethical behavior and it's unlawful, it's a crime. But utilitarianism does not take into account or does not care about it. Uh, because this action is producing great happiness for a great number of people. We can also think of Robin Hood, where he was robbing the king to help or destitute poor people. He was taking the wealth of the king to distribute it between destitute people. Another example could be forcing wealthy person to donate a body organ. So imagine there are 4 or 5 poor patients in a hospital whose lives depends on receiving organ transplant from someone. And a wealthy person is forced to sacrifice his life to save the life of 5 other patients by donating his eyes, his kidneys, or maybe his blood, donate blood to those 5 people to save their lives. So according to this theory of utilitarianism, this will produce greatest pleasure for a great number of people. This it's not considered wrong. However, human mind would hardly accept to save the life of others at the expense of someone else's life. So, based on principle of utilitarianism, it's totally fine because it produces the greatest amount of durable, long-lasting pleasure for a great number of people. What are the limitations and drawbacks of this philosophical theory? There are a lot of drawbacks and limitation for this theory. However, here I have explained and brought the most important ones. It's difficult in measuring happiness. It's difficult to predict future. Like it's not certain whether a certain amount or certain actions will bring good advantages or whether the advantages that or they bring, whether it's a short term or long term. So it's really difficult to certainly say whether the consequence of an action will be good or bad. So since we cannot predict future, it's difficult to be certain about it. The second most important drawback is ignoring individual rights. Utilitarianism prioritizes the greater good over individual rights. This can lead to situation where the happiness of the majority is achieved at the expense of the minority. We can refer to the second example where a wealthy person will be forced to sacrifice or compromise his life to save the life of five or four poor people. So he's his right to live is violated. His freedom of living is violated. The last one, but not least, is ignoring justice. Utilitarianism does not consider the principle of justice. So it's possible for an action to be morally justifiable but not produce the most happiness. Means that an action may be lawful, maybe an action may be legal, maybe may follow the principle of justice, but maybe that action does not bring happiness or joy. So that action is considered wrong and not good. It's considered bad based on principle of utilitarianism. However, an action may be illegal, may be unlawful, may not follow a principle of justice. But as long as it produces happiness for a great number of people, it's totally fine. It's considered good. So that's it for this presentation. I hope at the end of this presentation, now you have a clear understanding of the utilitarianism.